When you hear the term Latin Mass, what comes to mind? A beautiful ancient tradition in the church? A ceremony that transports us back in time? But there's more to the story than meets the eye. And today we're going to explore how the so-called Latin Mass movement might just be a scam. First, let's set the record straight. In the Roman Rite of the Catholic Church, every Mass is technically a Latin Mass, regardless of the language spoken. That's right. The term Latin Mass refers to the form of the Mass, not the language. It's called Latin because the Roman Rite has always had Latin as its sacred language. But it has always been celebrated in the vernacular language of the people when necessary. The controversy over the Latin Mass movement can be traced back to the 1960s, specifically to the Second Vatican Council, or Vatican II. This was a time when the Church sought to open itself up to the modern world and make its teachings more accessible to the faithful. Vatican II encouraged the use of Latin in the Mass, but shortly after the Council, the Vatican gave permission for the Mass to be said in the vernacular, that is, the language of the people, so that everyone could more fully participate in the liturgy. But not everyone was happy about it. Enter Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, a prominent bishop who was also part of the Vatican's Second Council. Despite his role at the Council, Lefebvre would become one of the leading figures in the movement to preserve what he called the traditional Latin Mass. Lefebvre believed that the Latin Mass of the pre-Vatican II Church was the answer to preserving Catholic tradition and saving the Church from the errors he saw in modernity. But here's the catch. The traditional Latin Mass of Lefebvre and others is not what many think it is. The Mass they refer to as traditional was the one established in 1962, right in the middle of Vatican II. In fact, the traditional Latin Mass of 1962 and the Novus Ordo, or New Mass, of 1970 are almost identical in many ways. They both include the same prayers, the same structure, and the same unchanging parts of the liturgy. The only real difference? The biblical readings. Now let's take a step back and think about what's happening here. In the Gospels, Jesus rebuked the Pharisees for their rigid, legalistic approach to faith. One of their beliefs? That prayer could only be offered in Hebrew. They saw language as a barrier to God's grace. Today, the modern Latin Mass movement mirrors this very same attitude, insisting that the Church can only pray in Latin. It's as if they've forgotten that the Mass is meant to be accessible to all. Not reserved for an elite few who can understand a dead language. Vatican II called for a church that is more inclusive, that speaks to the hearts of the faithful in the language they understand. Despite claims that the Latin Mass will save the Church, the reality is this. The Church is saved by Christ alone, and by a liturgy that opens hearts, not one that shuts them out. The Latin Mass movement may have convinced some that preserving Latin is the key to preserving tradition. But in reality, it's a movement born out of protest, not unity. And while they continue to fight for a Latin-only liturgy of 1962, the Church itself moves forward, reaching people where they are. So, the next time someone tells you that the Latin Mass is the only true form of worship, remember this. Every Mass in the Roman Rite is a Latin Mass by definition. What matters is not the language, but the prayer and the faith with which we pray. Let's not get lost in the language, let's focus on the message. Jesus Christ is the same, yesterday, today, and forever.